Hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone out there. I think this is episode number 13 of DiveSoft Dive Talks Live. So glad everyone could join us. My name is Joe Bosques. This week, my guest is author Gareth Locke. Gareth Locke is the author of highly acclaimed book Under Pressure, which is one of my favorite books. He has a long career in military aviation, and he's truly brought to the forefront of addressing the human factors in diving and dive accidents. He's the founder of The Human Diver, author of Under Pressure, Diving Deeper with Human Factors, and the producer of the illuminating documentary, If Only. So he's joining us this week. See if we can get him piped in. And I also want to thank everyone that's joining us too. All right. Hi, Gareth.
Hi, how you doing, Joe? It's good. Yeah. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you. We were talking online just before the show, so we were already getting all warmed up for conversation and whatnot. So it's we got a lot of people joining us already today. We have Mike Menduno. He's been joining us almost every week, so happy to see him on, right?
Good to see you, Mike.
Yeah,
it's been a long time since we've had a good face-to-face chat.
Yeah, it's at least with these live streams and these dive talks, we've been able to kind of keep a little bit of face-to-face with everyone in the community, and at least keep talking with everyone. So,
definitely. So I'm glad you like the book.
Yes, big fan, and we'll definitely dive into that in a moment. And give a little bit of a background on kind of where you're from and your background in the military for everybody watching.
Yeah, so it's been a pretty long career. I joined at 18 and I left at 44. So I went straight from school, no college for me, and I started flying on Hercules transport aircraft, and I did about 2,500 hours. I was a flight commander and a flight instructor on a squadron. Wow. And then sort of teaching tactical low-level operations and Halo, hey-ho type work as well. So lots of sort of high technical merit work. Mm-hmm. And then in 2004, I decided that I wasn't going anywhere flying-wise. And actually, I recognized that I was drifting myself. I was teaching my students the shortcuts that I'd learned over the sort of 10 years of flying, and thought, actually, I'm not probably the best person to be in this role if that's what I'm going to be doing. So I then moved into a technical role and did a master's degree in aerospace systems, which got me into systems thinking, understanding how stuff works together, not just about the avionics or the weapon systems or the propulsion, but how do you get an aircraft and a weapon system to work together? And that was my sort of introduction to human factors formally. You know, as a multi-crew aircraft, we operate to this concept called crew resource management, where the goal is to create a shared mental model amongst the five-man team, or actually we could be flying a 15 aircraft formation. And so now you've got lots of people that you've got to share this mental model. Yeah. So that was this sort of, CRM, crew resource management is just as a given. But then when I started to go through the masters, looking at human factors in the wider picture of how you design hardware to be error tolerant, to take into account, you can call it human error or performance variability, depending on whether or not you're looking at it in a negative way or a constructive way. And then I started to work in a trials role in a multinational project, and then worked into research and development through our organization called DSTL, which is similar to your DARPA across in the States. So Defense Science Technology Laboratories. So they're the guys who are doing sort of cutting edge research. And I describe my job, and anybody who's a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fan will know this concept of a Babel fish in a telephone directory. So I was the guy that converted geek speak into frontline operator speak, and then took the frontline operators' requirements and turned it back into geek speak for the analysts and the scientists.
It's like the communication top and the bottom, right?
Oh yeah. So and we were also, so I did 2.5 years there, and then my last 5 years was as a requirements manager and a systems engineer, procuring defensive aid systems for large transport aircraft and helicopters. So missile warning receivers, laser defeat mechanisms, chaff flare, those sorts of products and capabilities. And then because we were procuring the boxes that went into the aircraft, we then needed to work with the aircraft project teams and the aircraft suppliers and the people who programmed all of these things. So again, bringing that systems view into the fact that, yes, just because you've procured a box, it doesn't mean you've got a capability. You've got to take into account training, you've got equipment, people, the paperwork, the information that's required, any of the logistics or the infrastructure that needs to put together. And so that was sort of my last sort of 5 years. And I decided that, whilst I could have gone into the defense industry, I wanted to make use of the interest that I was getting in human factors. So that was in February 2015, I left. And my diving had sort of gone from around I certified in 99 and then didn't dive for about 5 years. And then got into diving. And at that sort of stage, that was about the time I was doing my master's as well. And it's like, hang on a minute, this sort of incident reporting and human factors and crew resource management that as aviation you just take for granted, I then look at the diving industry and go, hang on a minute, where is this stuff? We've got incident reports like Dan produce and the British Tobacco Club produce every year, but they're very superficial. They don't look at the systems view. Often they focus on the individual, the last person to touch it, and this bit of diver error. And it's not a particularly useful term when it comes to learning. So at that sort of stage, I was leaving the Air Force and getting more involved in the oil and gas sector, teaching the same skills there. And then the bottom fell out the oil market. So there's no money for training. And in January 2016, so that happened in sort of mid 2015. And I'm like, what do I do? What do I do? I want to do something in the diving industry, but how do I bring this in there? Because it's such a sort of theoretical concept, and people do it anyway, or so they think. And I knew that there was no way that I was going to be able to deliver a pure theory-based classroom to get people interested in this. And at the tail end of 2015, I came across this software tool called Gemasim, which was and still is the core of the 2-day programs that we deliver. But I then moved from doing classroom-based classes. The first one was in January 2016. And the feedback I got was brilliant, loved it, learned loads, have no idea how you're going to market this, because it's so, not against, but just isn't what the diving industry does.
It's very different.
So, it's very different, and it's looking at risk in a systems view. And we were talking earlier about the need to take a systems view or an ecosystem view of understanding how these things work together.
The big picture.
The big picture and how all the bits go together, not just these sort of silos. In the diving industry, we've got equipment manufacturers, we've got training agencies, we've got dive centers, we've got divers. Very distinct silos, and because of the way that people don't want to talk about the failures, it's all about limiting liability on yourself. So if you can protect your own by making it somebody else's problem, great. And that isn't how you improve safety. So since January 16, I've probably trained more than 350 people face-to-face in classroom-based classes. And that's, people from agency headquarters, it's through government organizations, instructors, divers across the globe, all the way from Seattle, Mexico, East Coast of the States, through Europe, Middle East, and then Australia, New Zealand, and then I managed to get out to Bali and Singapore last year. And I'm supposed to go back out to Australia and New Zealand later this year. So, and probably around about 1,500 people are subscribed to the online microclass as well, which was trying to make the learning more accessible to people in a sort of 2.5, 3 hour chunk. And the feedback for those who go through it is like, yes, this has changed my thoughts on how do I look at safety and how do I look at risk. So it's a long journey.
Yeah, you've had a very long journey, and and it's I see a lot of commonalities, like we were talking about earlier, kind of in my background in resource management, but I see a lot with, it reminds me a lot of the training that we had to do at NASA in terms of like 40-hour hazmat training, 40-hour OSHA training, where it is very, very different than what you typically see in the diving industry of more hands-on applications. This is very much like, all right, we're going to have to change the way you think and your perspective. And so it's, I always joke that the diving industry has people from all sorts of backgrounds, and so it's changed. When you have so many different backgrounds, you have all the different biases that come with that, and so addressing the behavior in that really is, I think it's a very unique training style that I think is really starting to take off.
Yeah. I mean, and actually one of the great things is that, I've had spin-offs. So I don't just teach in the diving community. I teach in other high-risk industries. So construction, oil and gas, healthcare.
It's very familiar with oil and gas.
Yeah. It's mass, it's really portable. And so I'll get people come on my class and go, you know what? This isn't just about diving. This is about life in general. It's like, yeah. We have teams, we have relationships, we need to communicate, we need to make decisions. The stuff that I teach in the class, and now my 5 other instructors out there teach this stuff, it is not just about diving and how to make diving safer. It's about how to look at the world differently. And I think one of the greatest benefits is, once seen, it's difficult to unsee. So you start to look at the world in a different way. And then you sit there and go, oh, why have they done that? And it's not because they're stupid. It's because there must have been something that made sense for them to do what they did. So let's look at the conditions or the behaviors, the environment. How did it make sense to do something which appears on the surface so stupid? But actually...
It's always 2020, right?
Oh God, yeah, and it's one of the hardest bits for learning, because people go, "Well, I wouldn't have done that because I would have." Yeah, exactly. And so the running out of gas is a classic one from Divers Alert Network and the research they'd done 10, 12 years ago now, where they looked at 900 plus fatalities, the trigger events for the ones they could identify, the first link in the chain that they could sort of identify. 41% of those fatalities were down to running out of gas. And you sit there and go, great, okay, that's not good. So Joe, when we go diving, don't run out of gas. I won't run out of gas. And so when I spoke to Petar Denoble, who's the head of research for DAN, I said, well, why did you start running out of gas? What was that point? He said, because there is such a lack of data prior to that. How did people run out of gas? Was it planning? Was it not aware of their consumption? Were they distracted? Were they, whatever it is, because it's those bits before the outcome is what we need to focus on. Focusing on outcome doesn't help learning. It's, don't get entangled, don't run out of gas, don't have a heart attack or a cardiac issue. So it's that bit that says, why are people running out of gas? Why are they getting entangled? Why is it that people are not using checklists and rebreathers and ending up in, dangerous or fatal situations? We've got to look at that side of it, not at the do your checks more. Well, that's great. Telling somebody to do something they haven't done is probably not going to change much.
It's the human factor. It's taking into the fact that it's like, well, I've done this 1,000 times, and I know it really well. That's the human factor. We want to be as efficient as possible and creatures of convenience.
Oh, very much. And depending on whether or not you're a positive or a critical person, you're either efficient or you're lazy. And often we judge whether or not that was a good outcome. If it was a good decision by the outcome. Hey, it worked okay, therefore I was efficient. It didn't go so well, therefore I was complacent or lazy. And it's like, well, the process is almost exactly the same.
Yeah.
So it's that bit we need to look at, not the outcome.
Something that I also find that, like, in a lot of your talks and kind of what you write, is that you're defining a lot of terms, and that's definitely something that you don't find in a lot of kind of talks when people are addressing accidents, is that they're not really defining things. They're very vague, like, it's human error, and
Yeah.
And like, could you kind of elaborate on how, like, defining
sure.
how it changes it?
So there's, human error is a useful bucket to put stuff into if you want to take it away from equipment or from environment. So, you can put it down to human. And then you sit there and go, okay, so what are the errors that we're talking about? Because error doesn't actually help us learn. And the aviation industry learned that big time in the sort of 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, where pilots were flying aircraft into the ground and it would go, pilot error. And then they would start listening to the cockpit voice recorders and analyzing the flight data recorders and the air traffic control tapes. And they say, hang on a minute, there were people on the flight deck that knew that something wasn't quite right, but they weren't able to explain it to the captain or whoever was flying the aircraft at the time. So you had this bit that says people knew that something wasn't right, so let's dig deeper. And so you end up with these, you could almost say, honest mistakes, errors that are there. And those are slips, lapses, and mistakes where we don't intend to do something. Or a slip it's something that it might be where you cross clip a bolt snap on your SPG and you don't realize you've done it, but you think you've done the right thing. Then if you've got a lapse where we've forgotten to do something, well, by definition, you won't remember something unless there is a trigger. So, the example I often give is I walk out the front door of the house and I hear the door go click behind me. And that's subconscious. I'm not paying attention to that, but there's a part of the brain that's filtering that says, door click, right. I need a key to get back in. Mm-hmm. Shit, the keys are actually in the house. Mm-hmm. And so what's required is that trigger that brings the memory to the forefront. And then we've got, mistakes where we're doing the wrong thing, but we think we're doing the right thing. Well, again, it's very difficult to criticize somebody for that, because if you ask them, what are you doing? Well, I'm doing the right thing. Well, no, it's not. And I think that's one of the big challenges we have in the diving industry, is that there are very few rules and standards that are applicable across all of the industry. And so you end up with these gray areas that don't necessarily help us whether or not somebody was doing the right thing, or we then get into the very emotional terms of violations, where we end up with an unintended violation, which is almost the same as a mistake, but there's a rule associated with it. So I didn't realize that I was breaking the rule. Then we get routine violations, where actually it's normal to do this. And so it's this bit that, right, everybody's going to do a pre-dive check before we get off the boat. Yeah, well, actually, it's really hard to be the person who follows the rules. The last liveaboard that I went on, I was one of 4 rebreather divers, and I was the only one using a written pre-dive checklist. And the grief that I got from the other 3 divers sitting there, and it takes a lot of mental courage to sit there and say, no, I am not going to bend to be the sort of sheep, because we are social creatures.
Especially yeah.
Oh, yeah. And the other thing about liveaboards is, the first couple of days, everybody's doing it right. And they're following all the rules. And then by the end of the week, it's like, yeah, off you go and jump in.
I'll suit up on a water.
Yeah, exactly. And you sit there going, So that's the routine violation. And then we get situational violation, where we end up in a situation where we can't actually undertake the task without breaking the rules. And that might be about the number of students you've got, for the class ratios. It might be about leaving students on the bottom while you sort out somebody on the surface, because it's like, well, how do I resolve this? Because now what you've got are commercial pressures that are coming into the situation that says, okay, we're now going to limit the number of people on our class, which means we limit the revenue, which means our prices go up, and then the public goes to another dive center who's delivering the same class as you are, but actually they're $100 a head cheaper, or whatever it is. So, and then we get into recklessness, which is where people normally categorize violations, where they have no thought or care for what the outcome is. And my argument is most people aren't like that. They're trying to do the best they can with the environment they've got, be that the sort of commercial or the social or the cultural environment, and trying to balance things up. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, today's a great day to die to get my student back. It doesn't happen. And the problem is that we are wired as bias, as having something called the fundamental attribution bias, where we'll turn around and say, they were stupid. And you go, okay, so we put the story on the individual rather than actually looking at the context and say, how did it make sense for that? So hopefully that's given you a bit of an explanation of the different bits.
No, yeah. I mean, what it shows is that it's the human factors. It's a broad, or human error is such a broad, big bucket, like you said, of that has so many factors that contribute to it. Dive instructors, just an example is that, I mean, nobody goes into it like with a kind of a recklessness of a disregard of people. I mean, they get into it because they love the sport, they love people, and to say like, well, he's just a reckless instructor, it's like it's too simple. And it's not, it doesn't address the, how did you get there? And yeah, it's so, yeah.
Building on that, is this bit that says actually, if the recklessness that's there, if it's genuine recklessness, then actually they should be dealt with accordingly. But punishment shouldn't be the first tool that comes out of the toolbox. But the other violations that are there, so routine, situational, and unintended violations, well, they all provide learning opportunities for the individual and for the organization, which they're training through, or the dive center or whatever. And that's where we have this concept called drift, because we have a natural tendency to be efficient. And that means that we might break the rules. And as long as we haven't got a bad outcome, okay, it must have been great. What we have to look at is the reflection, the debrief, the feedback that's saying, hang on a minute, as humans, we have a natural tendency to drift. To trust individuals to be honest all the time is a massive flaw in understanding human performance. So we need to have some means of making sure that what people are teaching, what they're doing, is actually being brought back to whatever the standards are. Now, what the standards are is another discussion itself.
But they're related. And something that you spoke about with with the flying industry and pilots, and well, there was a problem, but they weren't. The problem was not communicated to the pilot. You said before in other talks, pilots make 10, 20 errors at any given time, but they're able to. You coined the term trapping errors.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really interesting term. I don't know if you came up with it or not, but it's a full term in. Basically, it's recovering, saying you misclip a bolt snap, but you realize that you actually clipped to another bolt snap, or you clipped a reel to a dump valve, And so, what are some kind of? Have you been able to find some kind of ways or examples of ways of how divers or like rebreather divers can trap errors?
Yeah, so start off with, it's a little bit wider than trap. So you end up having avoid, trap, and mitigate is the way of looking at it. So to start off with, avoiding the errors is about designing systems to be error tolerant. So, at the hardware level, it's actually taking human factors principles in mind. And there are lots of ergonomics manuals out there that says, look, actually, when it comes to colors, font size, layout, symbology, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's out there that manufacturers can help develop that. The same goes for the agencies about how you would deliver programs for maximum retention rather than maximum throughput, which are, exactly. And yes, you can have the sort of script. The problem with having scripts and slates is, yes, that works as a scale model, but what happens is now you end up following that by rote, rather than actually that is a framework to think about what's going on. So you can avoid the errors from that perspective. As an individual, what you can start looking at are the conditions that are there. So if you are going to be rushed, if you're tired, all of these sort of precursors. And, in the documentary, If Only, I talk about this thing called the WITH model. And it's came from nuclear industries, where we're talking about workplace, workplace design, layout, individual capability, task demands, and human nature. And they provide a whole bunch of situations where errors are more likely to happen. And that could be peer pressure, it could be time pressures, it could be inadequate information, inadequate knowledge. So that's about trying to set us up for success to start with. Then we get into the trap process. And that really is about having standard operating procedures, SOPs, standards, team accountability. So, which then leads us on to knowing what we're all going to do on a task. And then we talk about individuals themselves, and especially in the rebreather side, is the use of structured checklists, which allow us to trap any errors due to our distractions, variable performance. And, you'd say to people, oh, checklists. And right, talk to me about checklists, Gareth, and how do we make these better in the diving industry? And you go, what do you mean by a checklist? Because actually checklists can be lots of different things, and they can be executed in different ways. So you could have a build checklist, which is done in a garage or a dive center in quite a sterile environment, and you don't have to worry about the elements. So you can work through items and tick them off a sheet. Then you've got an on-site checklist, which is so you've prepped your gear the night before, you've arrived on the dive site, and now you want to make sure that between building it the night before and you did the checks there, and arriving on the site, that it still works, that you haven't introduced a leak or the cells are still working or whatever. So you have an on-site checklist, and that goes through a set process. And then you have a pre-dive or a pre-jump checklist, which is inside sort of 5 minutes of getting off the back of the boat and making sure that the system is able to support life. It's not about doing a full systems check, because that's what the on-site check was about. These are your last minute checks that basically say, I step off the back of the boat and the system is going to support life. And if it's not in that situation, it's going to warn me and I'm going to notice really quickly. And there are different ways of doing those checklists, and how you execute them influences how you design them. So if you're going to dive on your own, you need to have a placeholder-based checklist system. And by what I mean by placeholder is you circle it that says that that's the check I'm doing, and you score through it and says I've done it. Don't do what you can have is this thing called chunking, where you do 3 or 4 and then you go, yeah, I've done that, because you will forget. And so you have a single line item, and that is called a read and do checklist. So you read the item, you do it, and you score it off and say, there's the placeholder, I've done it. Next line item, do it. If you're going to be operating in a team environment, what you've got here is a challenge and response. So actually, if we're diving the same gear, and I can say to you, Joe, right, what we're going to do is configuration. Talk about, HUD control or whatever it is, and we have a standardized check, and we cross-check each other and make sure that that's the case. Now, we don't need to have a placeholder piece, because we have a short standardized checklist. It's done from memory, and you're going to hold me accountable, and I'm going to hold you accountable. So we sit there on the boat, and you go, that's right, I've done this. No, Joe, you do it, or I'm not getting in the water with you.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't analyze the deal, and so.
Yeah.
So it's a big flag, and you're not going to push the luck.
Yeah, and so create the checklist for the team environment, the diving environment, and also the operational environment. You don't want to have, I've seen one organization talking about, right, let's put pre-dive checks for rebreathers into a mobile phone app. It's like, really? Who within 5 minutes to go is basically,
a while ago.
So what happens now is people don't do it. They don't do the check. I'll do it from memory. So build that into, and you can sit there going, well, we know what happens then if we rely on
we don't know nothing there.
So I believe that, the DiveSoft rebreathers, your checklist is in the handset and the controller, so you can actually follow through from
that's
to make
a jump effective. Yeah, right. That's supposed to be done 5 minutes prior.
Yeah. So and do you have high pressure sensors within your system? I don't want to go too geeky, but one of the Not yet. So that's one of the feedback, speaking to another manufacturer, we've done some analysis on an event, and actually having high pressure sensors allowed us to look at what was happening in terms of manual injection of gas rather than a solenoid being stuck on.
The changes.
Yeah, and so we could see that actually it wasn't a solenoid stuck on injecting oxygen in, it was a manual injection, and the PO2 got to more than 5.7, and unfortunately they died as a consequence. They were about 60 meters at the stage as well. So it was then working out why were they manually injecting oxygen, and then there was a bunch of other stuff. But the ability to have black box data is fantastic, to be able to try and recreate the actions. You can't recreate the thought processes, but you can certainly rule out other things. And that bit, for me, fatalities are not a great way of learning, because you can't ask the person how it made sense for them to do what they did, because the decision maker is normally dead in a fatality.
Yeah, it's already too late.
Exactly.
Another factor that at least that NASA had was, we had kind of a grade of accidents, right? If there was an incident where there was no property damage and no injuries in terms of like time away from work, where you weren't able to like report back,
lost time injury. Yeah,
there you go. It was a close call. And I see that a lot I don't see that at all in diving. And so a close call, that's like, it's a vague term, but you can kind of define it by like nothing was broken and there was no injury, but it's like surviving off the skin of your teeth, right? And so
definitely.
That's like the just before where I think you can really maximize the learning that comes from that. But to announce like, well, I had this mistake, I did this, there's a lot of society pressure that they're still around behind having an incident, because it could be, like you said earlier, where the blame could happen. Well, they were on this rebreather, it was this guy, how good of an instructor, how good of a diver is he if he makes this mistake? And then especially when you're unable to analyze the full big picture of it. So
it's a massive issue. From again, we look at this in systems terms, that we need to adjust culture to be able to allow people to tell the stories and not get, and it's not a no blame culture, because we said that if there is genuine recklessness, then actually that's the bit that needs to be punished, but everything else is a learning opportunity. That then says, okay, we are now allowing or encouraging people to speak up. Now we have to have this definition of what is an incident. And it's a project that I've been trying to get going, and I've been really busy with everything else, is actually define what an incident is. Yeah. Because then there's this bit that says, okay, and I've got some ideas, and I'm going to be doing it as a sort of global research project. And then we can start to look at what are the scales of those incidents that are there, the close calls, because I often get, what should I report? And it's this bit that says, okay, it's a compromise of safety. It's probably the easiest way. Now, if somebody has, an open water diver, an advanced open water diver has a free flow on a single cylinder, they might think that that's quite a risky situation. But if you've got an advanced trimix diver who has a free flow, it's like, shut it down, switch over. And so you sit there and go, it's not a compromise of safety. So, and yet they are both the same events, but it's the learning that goes on. So we've got to have some form of definition. We've also then got to have some form of capture. So I know that NASA, with the Aviation Safety Reporting System for aviation, they capture this stuff. And if it's reported as a safety event, it's not used as disciplinary action. So that's how they create the learning. So there isn't a repository that allows context-rich stories to be captured anywhere, really. You can go to DAN or you go to British Subaquia Club, but they are few and far between, considering how much diving goes on. Right. Then you've got to resource the back end. You've got to provide analysts and a framework that allow people to look at this in a technical aspect, a human factors aspect, a cultural aspect. and then put together a report that then can be put out there that's de-identified, so that people don't get the fingers pointed at them for, oh, stupid, I know that person. And then it's about trying to create the learning that's out there. So it's another big system problem, but it starts with having a just culture. Because if you don't have a just culture, nobody reports, nobody reads, and therefore the learning opportunities are lost.
And yeah, by just culture, you're meaning, a culture that kind of encourages the discussion rather than, punishing and disciplining it, and which, historically the diving industry, diving culture is not really, has never been really that way. But I think it's moving more that direction.
I do definitely.
Yeah, and I've asked like a couple of the different guests that I've had on the shows, like kind of which way do you think we've been going historically? And some folks say that it's still alive and well, and others say that it's like, oh, a thing of the past. So it's diving bubbles, diving communities are very significant in the way that they influence. So
definitely, I think people will be able to tell a story inside their team, their sort of bubble, their little community, because it's this thing called in-group and out-group behaviors. We'll protect people that are in our groups, but if somebody's outside, we'll criticize those. And it's this bit that says, well, actually, the story that's in our group would be equally relevant to that group, that group, that group, and that group. And what we've got to do is tell the complete story. And that includes where the rules and the standards have been broken, because often you'll hear, something's happened, and it's like, well, how on earth did they use all that gas? Because they said they entered the water with this amount and they ended it with that. Well, there's no way that they could have done. Maybe they didn't enter the water with the right amount of gas to start with. And then people go, well, there we go, you've broken the rule. And then you sit there and go, okay, let's find out why they entered the water without the correct amount of gas. And you can only define correct after the event, because if it went fine, well, it must have been the correct amount.
Everybody knows, yeah. It's let's see which way that it's, when things go right, we don't see the mistakes, we don't record the mistakes. We're able to kind of trap the error and then recover from it. But when we see the mistake, it could be a simple one, and that they didn't recover that time, and so but it's so important, the community, and I think it starts with instructors as being kind of, they have I wouldn't say a responsibility, but they're more in the role where they need to realize that even if you're operating in two-person in a buddy team, it's a team dynamic. And I know that GOE does a very good job of establishing, okay, who's directing the dive, what are the objectives, the mission, and so giving it that type of structure. It's like, oh, okay, so we need to think like this, rather than we're going on a fun dive. And you also talk about that sometimes with like working dives versus fun dives. It's a very misleading, kind of term to go off of, because you find more problems happen on fun dives than working dives, even though the demand is different.
Yeah, and I think because the risk is potentially more apparent in sort of working dives, and what you'd also find is that, things don't happen on big project dives, not normally anyway, because they are managed very well and it's unusual, so people are paying a little bit more attention. Whereas actually the fun dives that are there is that complacency, that creep, that drift, that normalization of deviance that's there, that is part of human nature. And it's this bit that says, actually, if we're going to do this, let's hold each other accountable, because we know we make errors and we know we drift. And part of that is, right from the outset of training, is encouraging instructors to recognize they are leaders. You sort of touched on this role model piece, that, my belief is that on an instructional course, a training course, you have two teams running in parallel. So you have a student team. So you might have 2 or 3 students on the class, and they are the student team. And then you have the learning team, of which the instructor is part of. So they are leading the instruction team, and then there is a pair that are learning. And what you're trying to do is transition from the leader the instructor being quite directive for the class, towards the end of it, where actually the leader's off to the side, the instructor's off to the side, and they're operating as a team on their own. And so they start to recognize that they need to operate as a team, and then we can start to hold each other accountable. But instructors are leaders, and if you don't think you are, well, you are developing people, you're mentoring, you're encouraging, you're motivating, you're getting people to do something different, and you are a role model. So whatever you do, your students will copy you. Even if you don't think you're doing it, they'll pick up your habits that you're not even seeing.
Even if you're not in a teaching role, like at the moment, if you're in that fun diving with your friends, but if you're an instructor, even if you're just a basic open water instructor and you're cave diving with your friends, there's still that responsibility that falls on to, like, well, I need to act the way that an instructor should act. I should follow my rules, and we all say that, but is it practice when you're underwater? Really deploy the long hose on that S drill, just because it's because it'll pay off when you don't expect it to pay off.
Yeah. I just on that, and in terms of check use, a number of years ago, I did a survey looking at instructors, rebreather instructors, and did they use checklists more in the teaching environment, or if they used them about the same as fun diving, or more in the fun diving environment. And there were a number of instructors who used them more in the training environment. So I said, well, okay, so why was that the case? And it's like, well, the agency standards say I have to, and it was all about compliance. And language means so much, because you can have an instructor that stands at the front of the class and says, right, I've got to teach you checklists because the agency standards say so, or the manufacturer's standards say so. And the message that comes across that says, you don't believe in those. So we're only doing the checklist for the class, and then you can go off and do it from memory afterwards. So, just little subtle things like that can have a huge impact. Yeah. So, we humans are quite simple creatures.
It's a term. It's like a bag of snakes. It's like just a collective thoughts, right? So we're just trying to be able to do these complicated exercises, consistently the right way. And so,
which reminds me of actually the phrase of, human factors is about making it easier to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. And as an example of, there's this thing called Norman doors, which is a push door that's got a pull handle on it. So you walk up to it and you don't even think about what the door layout is. You immediately grab the handle because it's there and you pull it towards you, and yet, because that's what you expect, but it's a push door. And there are so many things in life that have been designed with aesthetics in mind and not practical applicability. And they catch us out and frustrate us. So make it easy to do the right things and hard to do the wrong things.
It's in kind of discussing about the terms of this series of different types of checklists, kind of going back to that with the build checks, the pre-dive, and that's 5 minutes out, and then now that we're seeing, I see very often that kind of that cue card that a couple of training agencies has put out, I see some divers, they basically have it clipped to a D-ring and it's flapping in the wind, and it's literally the last thing that you check, and it's like touch your valves, touch your inflator, touch your mouthpiece, and then go. And creating those habits are what's going to stick with you, rather than doing it every other time, or only doing it when you have eyes on you.
Definitely. And so just on that is making the check count. So there's a Japanese term called shisha kanko, which is what the Japanese trained divers do. So they point, touch, and verbalize. So you use multiple senses. So it's the fact that I'll touch the valves, but actually I'll move the valve and then I look at the pressure gauge, because actually it's the response that I'm looking for, not the selection itself. So when you come to do those checks, it's about the response associated with the check, not the touching of the item itself. Touching is great, but then you can look at your handset and say, okay, PO, and say out loud, PO2 is 0.7. And so by looking, touching, and speaking out, now it helps you reinforce the memory, because there's so many times that people go, right, I'm going to check my gas, and you put it back and you go, what did that say? Because we don't actually read what is in front of us.
Yeah, like you look at your watch.
Yeah, exactly. What's the time? Oh, I don't know. So
look a couple times. Yeah.
So it's executing on the checklist rather than using it as a bit that you have to do the checklist. And you go, well, no, the checklist is to make sure the configuration is what I expect it to be, not that I'm executing the checklist. Right.
And a lot of kind of this, like, so in your human factors class, you kind of, how is it kind of designed to where, what do students walk away from in terms of, like, we kind of go over a lot of this, all of this material, kind of building the big picture and addressing the way that it's a way that you can kind of change your perspective on how you manage diving projects.
Yeah. So there's a number of classes that I've got. I've got a short online program, so about 2.5 hours, and that gives people the building blocks, the sort of the core theory. And until recently, the only other class was a 2-day computer-based simulation, teams of 6, and we would go through the theory and we would practice it using this computer-based simulation designed to teach people how to operate in a stressful, uncertain environment. It has nothing to do with diving. So everybody arrives at ground zero with zero knowledge about how to operate this system. And so as we go through the 2 days, we learn about building a team, how to create psychological safety, how to communicate effectively, understanding the pressures we're under and the impact that makes on our clarity of decision making. And the real key factors that come out of this is how to brief a mission effectively and how to debrief so we learn. And the debriefing happens, after every mission, and it's structured. And it's not just about, most debriefs are, okay, what went wrong? Nothing. Okay, let's move on. And the value of the debrief is nothing. So how do we get better? And what did we do well? Why did it go well? What are we going to improve on? And how are we going to do it? And it's how that's really important, because it's like, I've got to monitor my gas a bit better. Okay, how am I going to do that? Because that's the bit that we need to address. So then that's the end of the 2 days, and give people sort of a broad understanding of the skills, but then it is very much a coaching class and a self-discovery class. So it's very hard to say, right, and in terms of diving courses, here's a bit of plastic that allows you to go to 100 meters. It's nothing like that. It's a bit of a cheesy term, but it's this journey of self-discovery of yourself and your team.
Exactly it.
And it's, the reflection that's there. And, one of the comments that was shared yesterday on Facebook from the regular feedbacks I have is, sometimes the feedback is really quite hard and it can be brutal, but it's honest. And if you want to improve yourself, then actually you wouldn't be on this course anyway. And I think that's one of the bits that is people go, oh, I don't necessarily want to find out about this, and I don't see the value. It's very qualitative rather than quantitative. So that was the sort of 2 classes. And then earlier this year, because of COVID-19 and the lockdowns, because that 2-day class is delivered face-to-face, in March this year, I ran the first of, in fact, a second of a 10-week webinar series. So every week we discover a topic, and the sessions are about 90 minutes long. And then on the 1st of June, I started another one. So that's the 3rd session that I've run. And that's about halfway through. And that's been having great feedback. It's theory, interaction with the people on Zoom, and they've got homework to consolidate the learning before we then start the next session. And then on Monday, a new course starts, which is a bit of a nobody else. If you're watching this live, well done. You're going to get a bit of a coup here. Tomorrow, I'm going to release a new course that the first session is on the 11th and 12th of July. It is a blended learning program. So the theory starts on Monday coming, 29th. That is some online videos and some assessments and some consolidation exercises. And then on the 11th and 12th of July, we've got 2 4.5-hour days where we've got some quite cool software to bring the theory to life, looking at case studies. And so moving from knowledge development in the online e-learning environment through to skills development in the classroom, working as two teams to teach each other this knowledge. So you will have a greater understanding. And then 2 weeks after that classroom-based class, we're going to have a coaching call because when people finish the classes, they go, oh my God, there is so much to unpack. And it's over the next few days, they go, oh, I wish I could ask that. So we're going to basically tee up a 1 hour coaching call after the class so that they can unpack that stuff and ask any other questions. So it's a great way of learning, and they've got to own it.
Yeah, and I'm curious because, like you said, you used to do this face to face, and with COVID, and even before you were still doing some online, you were doing the e-learning style of it. Now, do you see any change in the effectiveness of it? Is it better or worse, or is it just different?
It's different, and I haven't done enough, and so all of the the class that was run in March and the one that's started on the 1st of June. Nobody's really been able to get back to diving and to be able to show that effectiveness. And actually, the effectiveness and the evidence to show the value of this is really hard to come by. But I still get people who took a class with me 2 years ago saying, you know what, I still do the debriefs. I still look at things differently. And so to me, that's fantastic.
Really long term.
Oh, yeah. Where I've asked people for feedback and for the stories that they've changed, there are very few people come back because it's like, well, what's in it for me? I've done the learning and I'm applying it. Why should I sort of tell the story to somebody else? So if there's any of the previous graduates and your life has changed in diving, give us a shout, please. So I'd love to hear the case studies and how things have changed. I've got some, but I would like much more, many more.
That's part of the culture of I wouldn't say a just culture, but that's part of like kind of the motto of like, once I became an instructor, I should go and participate in, say, an IDC, an instructor development course. And maybe I can contribute 2 cents, or maybe I don't contribute anything at all, but it's just an example of like a graduate of the course that learned a lot, that had a lot to take away from it, and can help a student going through the process in the shoes that I used to be in.
Yeah, definitely. That sort of continuous learning that's there,
right?
And that's very much a mindset rather than a compliance piece. And I think a lot of, again, sweeping generalizations. A lot of the diving industry, I think, is compliance based rather than sort of attitude and growth based.
Well, I think like how many industries are so global? I think flying, sailing, engineering. Those are very global. And so, but very structured as well. Scuba diving is not as structured, but it does have a very global reach with so many, backgrounds and whatnot. And so, it's it sounds like the human factors, the project is just exploding and growing, and so much from that. And then your book, Under Pressure, I have it right here. So, yeah,
I can see the thumbed corners. Excellent, well done.
Yeah. There's a lot of them. So it's in the book you talk about you got to take the whole picture in. If you just take a little bit of it, you're only seeing part of the puzzle. And and I encourage everyone that it's anyone that chooses to be teaching or be in a leadership role in diving, it's a must read. So
definitely, and sort of plug there. You can get it from the humandiver.com/under pressure, and I can ship it from you and I can sign it, or you can get it from Amazon, and they can make more money than and you'll get it cheaper because they pick up the postage as well. So and I don't get the money from Amazon until about 90 days after the sale as well. So if you want to get a copy signed, go visit the Human Diver website.
And then what was it? The documentary, If Only, did it come out? Was it in June or was it?
So it was the 20th of May, which was the second anniversary of Brian's death. And within a week, we got about 11,500 views on Vimeo.
Yeah, it's up to like almost 14,000 now.
So excellent, which is great. And what I've done since or in fact, as that was put out, I wrote a field guide or a workbook or just a facilitator's guide on how to play and run a workshop yourself using this film as a learning experience. So go on. You said some guests coming in.
No, yeah, we have some guests that just kind of joined in. It happens to be often. So.
Oh, how we didn't know if this was like a store.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But just for me to try not be distracted, because last week we have the UPS guy comes in, and the mailman. They always play with the dogs that we have here, so it's pretty fun.
So the documentary was really, really well received, and it's had some great feedback. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on what you thought of it.
I was a big fan. Like, I'm a big fan of seeing an analysis on accidents, because they're so unfortunate, and this story is very, very unfortunate. And what this did was kind of paint the whole picture of what happened, and I think it's going to be a very important tool that's going to stay with the diving industry for a long, long time, in terms of like teaching people how to communicate when you're in a class, because instructors are in the leadership role, but you have students that are in a course that they're not going to ask the instructor like, well, are you really qualified to know be talking about what you're saying? When I used to teach at the university, I used to ask the students all the time. I was like, have you ever seen a certification card from me? Have you? And they're always like, wait, what? Is that something I should be asking?
Yeah.
Right? And I asked them, I was like, have you ever seen me in the water? Have you ever seen anything that I do? How do you know I'm qualified? And those were just college students. I could imagine, a lot of these divers were military backgrounds, and they're not going to question the hierarchy of it. And it's not a hierarchy in a negative context. It's the norm. It's the norm, and it's following people in a leadership role. And so, I encourage students to always ask, what's my background? What about me? And it's not a negative thing, and instructors shouldn't take that negatively, because you've said in the past that instructors want to create thinking divers. Well, what the hell does that mean? And that's and I think that this documentary, if only, really shows the potential consequences of I always joke, you never want to force the fun, right? And when you push things, when you don't set kind of like internal mechanisms of where you say like, okay, here's the line, I'm not going to cross it. It's like the rule of the 3 oh no's. It's kind of the more PC term. If I say oh no 3 times, there's a line right there. It's a hard line in the sand that if I said it, looks like I'm out of it. That's 3 strikes. I'm just going to take the day off. And it's a very well produced documentary, and I encourage everyone that hasn't seen it to see it, and then even to see it again, later in time, because it's an important reminder.
Yeah, and so if you're in a sort of leadership or an influential position in a dive club, or if you're a dive safety officer in a scientific environment, the guide is there to run the workshop, and the sort of at its top level, the goal of those facilitated presentations is you read out, and I've written a little description of what happened, and it's maybe 6 or 7 lines of text. Read out what this is, and it's about a diver in top really high level terms gets off the back of the boat without the oxygen turned on in its rebreather. He goes hypoxic and drowns. There's a bit more than that, but that's really what happened. And then say, okay, on the whiteboard or with post-it notes or whatever, write down, what do you think happened? Why did that happen? And then you collect some ideas.
Yeah.
And then you play the first sort of 18, 20 minutes of the video, which ends before my analysis starts. And then say to those people there, okay, Now you've seen that. Now write some more reasons as to why you think the accident happened the way it did, and then play the last bit of the video, and then say, okay, write the last reasons why you think it is.
Mhm.
And then you can have the discussion piece that says, okay, so these were your first ones, and here's your second set, and here's your final set. How much more do we learn by looking at the whole story? And with a human factors lens that I looked at that, in that 18 minutes or so of narrative, I pulled out 53 contributory factors to the accident. And it looked at the failures of Brian, of the instructor, of the team, of the organizations involved. And you sit there and going, wow, okay, there are a lot of things here. You could simply just say, you know what, he got up off the bench without his oxygen turned on. He didn't notice the HUD, or he didn't notice the information that was given to him. He stepped off the back of the boat. He was busy in the current getting his camera and his stage cylinder sorted. He went hypoxic and drowned. Well, he should have turned his oxygen on. Well, in that case, most of the learning would be lost, because that's like saying, be more careful, pay more attention. Well, they are the worst root cause analysis, or the sort of recommendations out of investigation. Be more careful next time. Yeah, great, thanks.
Yeah,
that doesn't.
Like, wait, the goal is to not, it's like saying don't run out of gas. I didn't plan on it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a great. So it's humandiver.com/if only, and you can see the video and you can download the workbook from there. And Ashley, who's the widow, Brian's widow, has also got a scholarship fund where you can donate to there, which is for veterans who want to get into diving and explore the underwater realm. So she's a fantastic lady.
I really commend her on her, being able to be so transparent and to really be honest and open about everything with this. It takes a lot of strength to do that, to really put yourself out there. And I think, like I said, I think it's going to be a major important tool that's going to have lasting impacts in this industry and this sport.
I certainly hope so. It will be great to see it as part of training materials. And in fact, one of the other stories or one of the other use cases I've got was, an instructor, they will run their mod 1 or their, whatever class they're going to run, and then they, after 6 months or 3 to 6 months, phone up their students from the previous 3 to 6 months, and then say, okay, guys, we're going to have basically a screening. I want you to watch this. I want you to identify where you have started to drift based on these things here. So there's multiple ways of using this as a learning tool.
Well, it's a very versatile tool in that sense. So, well, great. And then you have the Human Diver, and if you haven't seen If Only, I very much recommend it. It's on Vimeo. They can find it, right?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Vimeo as well. So there's a Vimeo link, and the Vimeo links underneath the main image under on the If Only page on the Human Diver. So and I can't search for the link at the moment, but yeah, you can find it on Vimeo. You can find a whole bunch of other stuff on Vimeo for the Human Diver as well.
Great. And then be sure to pick up a copy of Under Pressure. Fantastic book. I can't recommend it more. And thank you so much, Gareth, for joining us today. I think this was it was a really interesting and exciting talk. So,
thank you very much for your time and the invite. I mean, I'm just passionate about sharing this. You can tell by the enthusiasm. So, more than happy to talk with other organizations and clubs and things like that. So, share the knowledge. That's how people get better.
Exactly.
So
yeah, that's much better. And hopefully pretty soon things will open up and then we can go diving again, next time you're over here.
Definitely. It'd be great to do so. So thank you very much, Joe, for hosting us.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone that tuned in today for our DiveSoft Dive Talks Live. Be sure to tune in next week. My guest next week is going to be Paul Toomer from RAID, a very exciting and new training agency. So it'll be an exciting talk, and we've got a lot to talk about. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.